But what is all this about punishment and advocate, said Kay. Surely Amalia couldn't be accused or punished because of Sortini's criminal proceedings. Yes, said Olga. She could not in a regular suit at law, of course. And she wasn't punished directly. But she was punished, all right, in other ways. She and our whole family. And how heavy the punishment has been, you are surely beginning to understand. In your opinion, it's unjust and monstrous. But you're the only one in the village of that opinion. It's an opinion favorable to us and ought to comfort us. And it would do that if it weren't so obviously based on error. I can easily prove that, and you must forgive me if I mention Frida, by the way. But between Frida and Clam, leaving aside the final outcome of the two affairs, the first preliminaries were much the same as between Amalia and Sortini. And yet, although that might have shocked you at the beginning, you accept it now as quite natural. And that's not merely because you're accustomed to it. Custom alone couldn't blunt one's plain judgment. It's simply that you freed yourself from prejudice. No, Olga, said Kay. I don't see why you drag in Frida. Her case wasn't the same. Don't confuse two such different things. And now go on with your story. Please don't be offended, said Olga. If I persist in the comparison, it's a lingering trace of prejudice on your part, even in regard to Frida, that makes you feel you must defend her from a comparison. She's not to be defended, but only to be praised. In comparing the two cases, I don't say they're exactly alike. They stand in the same relation as black to white, and the white is Frida. The worst thing one can do to Frida is to laugh at her, as I did in the bar, very rudely, and I was sorry for it later. On the other hand, unless one is related to her by blood, one can only despise Amalia. Therefore, the two cases are quite different, as you say, but yet they're alike. They're not at all alike, said Kay, and he shook his head stubbornly. Leave Frida out of it. Frida got no such fine letter as that of Sortini's, and Frida was really in love with Clam. And if you doubt that, you need only ask her. She loves him still. But is that really a difference? Asked Olga. Do you imagine Clam couldn't have written to Frida in the same tone? That's what the gentlemen are like when they rise from their desks. They feel out of place in the ordinary world, and in their distraction, they say the most beastly things. Not all of them, but many of them. The letter to Amalia may have been the thought of a moment, thrown on the paper in complete disregard for the meaning to be taken out of it. What do we know of the thoughts of these gentlemen? Haven't you heard of, or heard yourself, the tone in which Clam spoke to Frida? Clam notorious for his rudeness. He can apparently sit dumb for hours and then suddenly bring out something so brutal that it makes one shiver. Nothing of that kind is known of Sortini, but then very little is known of him. All that's really known about him is that his name is like Sordini's. If it weren't for that resemblance between the two names, probably he wouldn't be known at all. Even as the fire brigade authority, apparently he's still confused with Sordini, who is the real authority and who exploits the resemblance in name to push things onto Sortini's shoulders, especially any duties falling on him as a deputy, so that he can be left undisturbed to his work. Now, when a man so unused to society as Sortini is, suddenly finds himself in love with a village girl, he'll naturally take it quite differently from, say, the joiner's apprentice next door. And one must remember, too, that between an official and a village cobbler's daughter, there's a great gulf fixed, which has to be somehow bridged over. And Sortini tried to do it in that way, where someone else might have acted differently. Of course, we're all supposed to belong to the castle, and there's supposed to be no gulf between us and nothing to be bridged over. And that may be true enough on ordinary occasions. But we've had grim evidence that it's not true when anything really important crops up. At any rate, all that should make Sortini's methods more comprehensible to you and less monstrous. Compared with Clam's, they're comparatively reasonable. And even for those intimately affected by them, much more endurable. When Clam writes a loving letter, it's much more exasperating than the most brutal letter of Sortini's. Don't mistake me, I'm not venturing to criticize Clam. I'm only comparing the two because you're shutting your eyes to the comparison. Clam's a kind of tyrant over women. He orders first one and then another to come to him, puts up with none of them for long, and orders them to go just as he ordered them to come. Oh, Clam wouldn't even give himself the trouble of writing a letter first. And in comparison with that, is it so monstrous that Sortini, who's so retiring and whose relations with women are at least unknown, should condescend for once to write in his beautiful official hand a letter, however abominable? And if there's no distinction here in Clam's favor, but the reverse, how can Frida's love for him establish one? The relation existing between the women and the officials, believe me, is very difficult, or rather easy to determine. Love always enters into it. There's no such thing as an official's unhappy love affair. So in that respect, it's no praise to say of a girl, I'm referring to many others besides Frida, that she gave herself to an official only out of love. She loved him and gave herself to him. That was all. There's nothing praiseworthy in that. But you'll object that Amalia didn't love Sortini, Well, perhaps she didn't love him. But then after all, perhaps she did love him. Who can decide? Not even she herself. How can she fancy she didn't love him when she rejected him so violently, as no official has ever been rejected? Barnabas says that even yet, she sometimes trembles with the violence of the effort of closing the window 3 years ago. That is true.